Well, hello there. You're probably confused since you clicked on this video to watch a cartoon dog talk about Canadian animation, and yet here's this random face plastered onto your screen. Don't worry, the cartoon dog quota will still be hit in this video. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Dan, and I run a YouTube channel where I talk about things. And it just so happens that animation is technically a thing, so when good friend and best boy Wacky Deli asked me to help him out on a video about Canadian animation from the National Film Board of Canada, you bet your bottom dollar that I said, yeah, okay, I can do that. Now, I may not exactly be the sharpest tool in the shed when it comes to Canada. In fact, I'm still learning new things every day. Like listen to this, for example. Did you know that there's a New Brunswick? Anyway, that's not really important, but what is important is that it doesn't matter how little I know about our neighbors to the north, especially in terms of animation. And that's okay. You want to know what's great about animation? 9 out of 10 times, the geographic location of where the animation was created doesn't have an effect on the final product's universal impact. The mark of great animation isn't one that's bound down by such a restriction. In fact, it doesn't even look at that as a restriction, instead opting to take it as a sort of birthright for the nation of creation. Like, take this John Weldon guy. He's a Canadian actor, director, composer, and animator whose resume is primarily composed of animated films for the National Film Board of Canada. Despite that, the stories he's able to tell through his films and animation style are ones that can equally be enjoyed by people all over the world. Weldon's talents also aren't tied down to just one specific style or skill, which definitely helps his case for the impact of his films. He's done musicals, PSAs, live-action hybrids, and more. In fact, it wouldn't do any justice to the universal impact of Weldon's work if we didn't dive deeper into what he's worked on. So, without further ado, let's start with what is undoubtedly his most famous work, Log Driver's Waltz, in which... Oh, Deli already did that last year? I was kind of planning on doing this whole thing with the law. You know what? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. I'm gonna let this one go. I'll let Deli take the first short, and then I'll have something to talk about right after he's done. Take it away, Deli.
The good fairy, she's a come. My boy, the good fairy, she's a come.
Spinolio is a 1977 film that subverts a classic fairy tale by making it a commentary on the transient ups and downs of life. In this case, the aforementioned Spinolio, a chaotically led but still equally inanimate play on Pinocchio, is given a life of his own by his deranged father hucking him out the door to attend grade school. From there, he rises the corporate ranks, gets incarcerated, groups with a gang of local bikers, and so much more. The ending, which perhaps falls in line with more of the original fairy tale, serves as a conclusion to the tete-a-tete of sociological folly when paired up with the film at large. So when I think about John Weldon's work, I think of it as living water. It's really elastic and flowy, but it always maintains a sense of form to it. It's arguably closer to flubber than water, but that's neither here nor there. It's always a bit more variable, but earlier on I think his pieces had a more frenetic and lively energy to it. The Log Driver's Waltz exemplifies this in spades, which is part of why it's one of my favorite short films, hands down. Here the story still keeps the signature Weldon flair, albeit far more subdued. I believe it's trying to tether the tale closer to reality, and it's still very much an animated retelling for a reason, but everything has more of a weight to it here. The way the story is told is pretty hilarious. It hits you over the head with its message, but it has a lot of fun doing it. There's a sense of whimsical pittance to it. But you don't really get to drink it in until the last minute or so. The pacing does really find a way to suck you in without compromising or dragging out the story. It takes the time to compose itself without sacrificing its source material. The little details like the flapping head of the judge or the literal writing on the wall really sweeten the deal. The background work helps to further bring this to life despite the defining grade of static. It's very traditional in a way, the etchings and the scratchy textures help give this a more classical feel. The music design is also comparable to a lot of other films in its grade. It does carry a more whimsical tone about it despite being party to a very amusing but avant-garde story. So, all in all, it's a pretty fascinating short that makes the most of its initial impressions to land its main vibe.
Alright, let's talk about 1984's emergency numbers, although there's not much to discuss here since the entire film only lasts about 2 minutes. Yes, this actually falls under NFB's series entitled Canada Vignettes. It's pretty self-explanatory what that title entails, so I'm not going to harp on it, but in case you didn't know, a vignette is basically a short yet descriptive piece. And yeah, emergency numbers is definitely that. The story revolves around a cat, whose relaxing night at home is interrupted when a wild dog invades his house. After being chased around a bit, he eventually makes it to the phone, where he has a list of emergency numbers taped to the wall, and after finding the number for the dog catcher, he calls them, and they arrive quickly, and they snatch up the dog. And yeah, that's basically it. It's plain and simple, and it drives the point home in an extremely direct manner. But that doesn't mean we can't dissect the details. First up, let's discuss the animation. The character movements are extremely unconventional, and I mean that in the best way possible. Like, there's so many moving parts to the simplest of actions, like standing up and walking. You could see the shoulders bobbing up and down to the rhythm of the cat's movement. There's also the action of the dog chasing the cat, where most of the time, instead of the dog just statically moving his body forward in the motion of chasing the cat, his body moves up and down in a sort of sine wave pattern, and that helps add some personality to these characters. For having no dialogue, the cat and dog play off each other very well. Despite being chased for most of the short, the cat remains collective throughout most of it, constantly making smart choices to avoid the dog. Although he probably shouldn't have just opened the door in the beginning for a stranger in the middle of the night, but I digress. The first thing he does when he escapes the dog is try to reach the phone to call emergency services. He's scared, and you can definitely see that in his face, but thanks to the smart choices he makes throughout the short, is able to narrowly avoid the dog while sustaining minimal damage. Meanwhile, the dog is crazed, with the only thing that matters to him being the cat. This ups his scare factor, as his determination is unsettling, but this also makes him blind to many of his surroundings, like the lamp and the Venetian blinds. However, whereas the characters and animation shine, if you think about it for like more than 30 seconds, the message that they're trying to portray in this film kind of sort of flubs, and that's not a great look for a PSA. So yeah, the cat has the emergency numbers right by the phone, which is important, but when he's skimming the list, he just skips over the police. On my first watch, I thought that he accidentally missed it, but no, he was looking for the number for the dog catcher instead. I was under the assumption that dog catchers didn't exist in this world since it was filled with anthropomorphic cats and dogs, but that was just more of an assumption. That being said, this PSA is basically teaching you to contact a dog catcher instead of the police if you're being attacked by a wild dog. Yeah, no? If a wild dog is attacking you, if you have the police's number at hand above the dog catcher, or hell, even if you don't, just call the damn police. This isn't even a case of product of its time, as I'm like 90% sure that in 1984, you still should call the police if you're being attacked by a wild dog, especially if it just invades your home. I understand the dog is like probably a metaphor for something, but you should still be contacting the police first and foremost if there's an emergency of this caliber. Don't worry about calling a specific group. I'm just glad that the dog finally did get caught, and his wacky antics were put to an end. Oh, no offense, Dilly.
Frank conjectured that in a former life he had performed heroic acts.
Frank the Rabbit is a 1998 piece that tells the story of the eponymous creature trying to weave his own personal story into the grand tapestry of history. He starts off pretty isolated, much like the previously maligned Spinolio, but through his advanced wit and emotional development, he accidentally lands up in the arms of a little girl, and as a local demigod for a bit of Lapin-led trickery. This is actually one of the first works from the NFB I'd ever seen. And having rewatched it, it must have been a bit polarizing to see as the same organization that helped make something like Bob's Birthday or even Karate Kids. Film's a trip. It's very much Weldonian in execution and concept, but quite honestly, its presentation stands to blindside you. It shares a lot of the same attributes and characteristic flourishes laid out in the previous parts, but it does it in a very specific way that's almost uncanny. For one, it's evident to me that this was digitally animated, no doubt with a lot of the same flourish and pep your average Flash or Toon Boom animated Leaf Toon contains today. There are other films that seem to follow in this method, like 96's Scant Sanity, but this one was perhaps not made in this way to stand out from the crowd. You notice that the smaller character movements are dictated like a storybook animation. Sometimes the drawings just blend into the next, like an anamorph in action. A lot of it is less animated rather than digitally manipulated. There are a lot of smart panning and cutting and motion blur to it. It's a lot to get wrapped up in. It almost makes concepts like a farmer walking a lot to accept. Interestingly enough, the visuals do very much in the way of emulating the older, rougher animations of the previous century. There's many an instance where sketchy pencil marks and more traditional shading really contrasts against the artificial texture work and the digital collaging. The film score and the narrator give this the impression that it's a saccharine-feeling children's special. Obviously, the protagonist and general softness of the design work doesn't do much to alleviate such a discrepancy. It does more to help you think like a rabbit than the story does. Granted, even with all the simple realities presented throughout, it still presents as really, really cartoony. It's a really interesting pastiche. It took a bit of growing on me, but I really learned to appreciate it.
Ralph wondered if he should turn himself in. He remembered that a mailman had once broken his leg on a friend's property, and that had cost the friend a lot of money.
1978's Special Delivery was not what I was expecting at all. It revolves around the death of a mailman who slipped and broke his neck on the icy walk of the house, and how the husband and wife both react to and handle this shocking discovery. The husband, named Ralph, is nervous that he'll get caught and prosecuted by the letter carriers union since he was supposed to shovel the walk per his wife's orders. He comes up with a plan to hide the body in his house and disguise himself as a mailman to finish up the dead mailman's route before getting rid of the body once and for all. This plan almost works out until he realizes that he forgot his keys inside his house, so he has to sneak in through the window. However, cops passing by at the time think that the mailman is trying to sneak into Ralph's house, so they take him down to the station. Meanwhile, the wife, named Alice, returns home to see the naked mailman in her living room. At first, she thinks the mailman snuck in to see her, since it was revealed that they had an affair. Extremely nonchalantly, might I add. Not knowing the mailman is actually dead, Alice decides to clothe him and drive him back to his apartment. It's only right before leaving the apartment that Alice realizes that the mailman is actually dead. I don't want to spoil the ending of either of these characters' stories, so I highly recommend watching the film yourself, seeing as it only clocks in at about 7 minutes. The animation and art style were the first things that really popped out to me upon first viewing. For most of the film, there is constant motion, even when the characters are standing still. The outlines of the characters and even the objects and landscapes are constantly moving about. This method is often referred to as line boil, in which the outlines of hand-drawn characters tend to wobble, especially when the characters are drawn frame by frame. I found myself thinking back to home movie Squigglevision and Ed, Edd and Eddy, which interestingly enough is also a Canadian cartoon. Shockingly, the outlines in this film aren't the only thing to constantly be in motion, but also the colors that the outlines hold in place. The coloring in this film has a very crude look to it, almost as if it was colored in with a crayon or colored pencil, which would account for the constant movement of the colors if this was drawn frame by frame. Despite the color scheme being crude, the character designs are anything but. They have a very comforting and familiar feel to them. When I look at these characters, I can't help but imagine a mixture of character designs from multiple Sunday funnies, including Peanuts, Bloom County, and especially Baby Blues. No doubt though, the best part about these characters' designs and the crude art style has to be the fact that they clash so beautifully with the dark overlying story. This story about murder plays out like an episode of a soap opera. This is helped by the fact that the score is done entirely with an organ, playing multiple dramatic stings and cues for when the story builds up tension. I should also mention that there's barely any dialogue in this story at all, instead relying heavily on a narrator, who explains what's happening in the story. His vocal direction reminds me so much of those coronet instructional films from back in the late 40s and early 50s. You know the ones like Are You Popular and Bookkeeping in You, and my personal favorite, Good Table Manners, in which a young boy meets his future self so that they can talk about how to behave at a dinner table. But personally, I wouldn't take any advice from a future version of myself if he was wearing the same exact sweater that I was at the moment. I'm just saying. Anyway, the vocal direction in this film adds to the overall feel of the soap opera, keeping a very dry and monotone voice through even the most intense moments. Now, this film isn't perfect, mind you. There has to be some suspension of disbelief in order to ignore the next-door neighbors cannot recognize Ralph up close and personal, and that the wife didn't think about the rigor mortis of the mailman's body when transferring him back to his apartment. That being said, those are very minor gripes in what's a deviously twisted story that subverted my expectations. This film was so positively received that it even won the Oscar for Best Animated Short Film in 1978. It even beat out legendary stop-motion animator Will Vinton's short film, Rip Van Winkle. All in all, Special Delivery lived up to its name, as there was indeed something special about the delivery of this classic John Weldon piece. Wow, that was a stretch even for